to Off the Record News. I'm your host, Diana Longry. Thank you for tuning in. Off the Record News is brought to you from the SPNN studios in St. Paul. Now, tonight we are going to be talking about the Climate Resilience Plan that was adopted by the St. Paul City Council in December, specifically on December 18th, 2019. Now, this, of course, may sound like it's just the normal course of business. However, this 61-page document contains a lot of information and a lot of directives that will have an impact on the policy created by the St. Paul City Council, the St. Paul Mayor, and their administrative staff. And these public policies will have a great impact on not only the residents of St. Paul, but the businesses of St. Paul as well. Now, at the council meeting, they talked about certain aspects of this climate resilience plan that they adopted, but they didn't really go into what are some of the unintended consequences that may result as a result of passing this plan, and what are some of the things they should watch out for when they use this as the measuring stick by which they are going to make their decisions. Now, I have with me this evening to help with the discussion and go through the analysis Mr. Greg Copeland, who is a St. Paul resident and who has been watching this topic very closely. Thank you, Mr. Copeland, for being here.
It's always great to be with you, Diana, on these missions of education and analysis.
Well, we certainly have a lot of film footage on this topic this evening. The City Council actually spent quite a bit of time on this item. And what I found fascinating about this item as compared to the other items that they had on their agenda, which were also set for public hearing, is that this item set for public hearing, unlike the others, actually came with a staff report. Most of all the other items on the agenda that were set for a public hearing had no staff report. They simply said, up next is item number such and such. This is what it is. We're opening the public hearing. Is there anyone to talk? There isn't. Okay, ayes all. And that's the way that most of the meeting went. However, when it came to this item, as a public hearing item, they did have a staff report, which went on quite a long time, and that's, of course, why we have such a wealth of film footage to go through. Now, a few shows ago, Mr. Copeland, you probably weren't here for this particular show, but we had a show where we went through discussions that Maplewood had on their climate adaptation plan that the Environmental and Natural Resources Commission was going through. And that is a little bit different than this climate resilience plan that St. Paul is looking at implementing. Whereas Maplewood's climate adaptation plan was looking at knowing what climate changes are going to be in the future, how do we have to adapt our processes so that we are keeping up with the times of the fact that there's climate change, which is very different than what the plan is in St. Paul, which says, what are we going to do to change all of our lifestyles so that we can have an impact on climate change? So you see, it's a difference of perspective, and I found that very interesting when I was watching the film footage from the St. Paul City Council meeting and comparing it to what I've already reported on coming out of Maplewood.
Well, I'm going to guess, Diana, that the city of Maplewood did not have a grant from Mr. Bloomberg, the new presidential candidate. Well, before he was a presidential candidate, he issued a grant to Minneapolis and St. Paul under his Bloomberg American Cities Climate Challenge. And that's partially funding this whole discussion that's occurred in St. Paul, supposedly. You know, now, of course, I don't think he's paying for our sustainability officer, which formerly had been a member of the city council, and when he got promoted by the mayor, the current mayor, he doubled his pay. So it's always good to get a promotion from the current mayor, because you know, he really takes you up a couple notches.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Well, let's get started with our film footage. Our first clip is when the item is being introduced to the City Council. Let's take a look.
Item number 83, Resolution Public Hearing 19-416, adopting the Climate Action and Resilience Plan.
And I believe our Chief Resilience Officer, Mr. Russ Stark, is going to be giving us a staff report. Welcome. This is an exciting day.
It is an exciting day. Council President Brenmo, council members, great to be here in front of you this evening on the culmination of a lot of work a lot of folks in this room have been involved in. Russ Stark, Chief Resilience Officer, Mayor Carter's office, and here to talk to you tonight about the St. Paul Climate Action and Resilience Plan, which has, I've been saying draft for the last 8 months when I do this presentation, but today I'm going to remove the draft maybe a little bit presumptuously and say St. Paul Climate Action and Resilience Plan.
That's the introduction, and you can see where there's the presumption that this resolution for adopting this climate resilience plan is going to pass because they've been working on it for 8 months in the back room. They have had a number of events out in the public where they were trying to get community input of sorts. And he does go through much of that during the beginning of his presentation. So certainly, if you would like to hear more about that, you can go and watch the film footage in its entirety on the city's website. But that's not really the focus that we have here tonight on the citizen engagement aspect of it. Although later on, we will have some commentary from one of the city council members asking about citizen engagement. So it almost appears that some of the council members aren't really quite convinced that there was enough citizen engagement in this whole process.
Well, given the breadth of what this plan attempts to accomplish, it's hard to imagine that they had enough input. I mean, there's a lot here, and there's a lot of costs to individuals, to the city, to other entities that are funded by tax dollars. And even if Mayor Bloomberg gets to be president, we're going to end up footing the bill for these wonderful ideas.
Right. And you know, one entity that we didn't put on our character generator in the title of this show, the impacts, we have the impacts to residents and to St. Paul businesses. But, you know, Mr. Copeland, before the program, you talked about how this is actually going to have an impact on the city of St. Paul itself, and we'll get into that a little bit more as well. But I want our viewers to realize that this plan will have an impact on everybody, including the St. Paul city government itself and their property interests. So let's get started with, let's do go to our next clip, which talks a little bit about why the plan.
Half of the plan is really focused on the areas in which we're going to have to adapt to the already changing climate and become a more resilient city. The second half of the plan is all about the ways in which we're going to do our part to reduce greenhouse gas emissions so that we can prevent much worse impacts of continued climate change over time.
Now, of course, in theory, this is all very important to understand what climate change is or is not, about the generation of greenhouse gases and the impact on the world and what creates the most in greenhouse gases and what types of activities maybe are not as sustainable as other activities. All that type of research is all very good. But the question then is that when you put that into a plan, are you putting it into a plan that's actually feasible and practical for your community and the people who live in your community? And I know that, Mr. Copeland, you took a look at the plan and you noticed that there was quite a few directives in there.
Well, there's quite a few directives. There's also, I think, some unanticipated consequences that were not addressed. I went to a meeting in my neighborhood in the Payne-Phelan area when Mr. Stark made a presentation to our district council, and he had a graphic dealing with the issue of sewage treatment and whatnot, but he wasn't talking too much about the fact that the Met Council operates 2 incinerators and may well have 3 incinerators down at Pig's Eye, which is a part of St. Paul here, obviously, and is under the St. Paul city jurisdiction. And, these folks put in, back in the early 90s, 2 new incinerators. So they're burning less because the federal government came in and said, there's mercury going into our river because of your sewage operation. So they went and built these things. Well, they were somewhat more efficient, but we still have issues with these problems with these metals and whatnot. When you're burning things, that's what happens. And we're talking about burning solids that are left over after sewage treatment. So I don't know if the mayor and his group or his sustainability officer is down there at the sewer plant talking to the Met Council or not, but I tried to point out that that's a major source of pollution in our city. And as I say, they want to build a 3rd one because they need, supposedly because they have to do maintenance on the other 2 and they can't completely shut down the system. And you can imagine that would be a problem.
And so then that goes to that issue in the future. Will the St. Paul City Council then use this climate resilience plan as the yardstick by which then they measure that 3rd plant when the proposal comes before them for it to be constructed?
Yeah, when that building permit application lands on the desk at DSI, what are they going to do? Plan or no plan? And did they get an exemption at the Met Council, up at the legislature? I mean, who knows? The things that go on around here, the government, there's an old lawyer, he told me, the government doesn't have to obey their own rules. And I thought, and I was a much younger guy in those days, and I thought, well, that's kind of a bad thing, isn't it? When you have government telling everybody else you got to do X, and you get to do nothing like X. And so that's a big question mark. And then there's another aspect too to this thing, because they talk all about this transition away from our current gasoline and diesel burning cars. And I guess you're going to go a little more into that, so maybe I should wait on that aspect of it.
Okay, very good. Well, and that is a perfect lead-in to our next clip, because there are several different segments that he discusses in his presentation to the council, but the aspect that we want to focus on this evening is that section of the climate resilience plan that focuses on transportation, because transportation is critical to the residents of St. Paul and critical to the businesses of St. Paul. So let's take a look at our first clip.
On the transportation side, 2 main strategies, no surprises here. We're going to have to reduce the amount of driving that we do in single occupant vehicles, as well, which has to involve significant increases in transit ridership, as well as biking and walking for shorter trips, which has to involve significant investments in our transit system, paired with the investments that we are making, frankly, on the biking and walking side.
In other words, when you look at those numbers, this is setting goals for decreasing the number of single occupant cars in the city. Well, that might be very hard to do, especially when you have families that have many people within their family all going to different jobs, all in different places, that they can't just walk down the street to their job, that they have 2 or 3 different jobs during the week, and that those jobs are not necessarily located in St. Paul, that they may be located in many different areas throughout the metro, and that this push to decrease the number of single occupant cars is going to have an impact on a significant number of people in St. Paul who rely upon their cars because they need to get to their 2 or 3 jobs that they have to go to, plus daycare, plus get the kids off to school, plus whatever else they got to do. Now,
Yeah.
Mr. Copeland, I know that you had some statistics on the use of cars in St. Paul.
Well, yeah, there's, I'll just give it to you. Streets, Minnesota, MN, and you can go to it and there's a map. And you can put in other jurisdictions around the country as well as ours. But in St. Paul, I didn't go through every zip code, but the zip code that I happen to live in, 55130, just north of downtown, the Payne-Phelan area, not the whole area, has the lowest income per capita in the city, whereas the 55105 zip code, just north of the lowest part of Highland, I guess you might describe it that way, the Calvert Grove in those areas, is at 50,000, almost 51,000 really, with newer numbers, I'm sure. Now this is a map from June 2019, so there's always a lag in data. But your point, Diana, is exactly borne out in this map, that the people with the least money have the most people. In other words, each per capita, if you will, it's in the car that the family has, which is, in the case of the poorest people, they've got less than half a car. But they've got 2.3 people that are using that car. Whereas the most wealthy folks, well, they've got 3/4 of a car. And only 1.39 people are using that car. Now, these are the stats, and we all know how that goes. But your point is well made. For those who do have cars, those few over on my side of town, where the bus is already full. I mean, I can agree with the goal of, we got to spend some more money on transit. Yes, I actually said spend more money because it's needed. But, it's needed right now. And that was before anybody dreamed up a resiliency plan.
Right, and also it goes to that point of when you're investing such high amount of dollars on these dedicated BRT routes,
Exactly.
where you have to construct a whole a road bed for the BRT because you're not going to run it on a regular traditional road, such as the Rush Line through Maplewood on the Bruce Vento. Think about how many bus routes you could customize to where the people are and where the need is, using that money,
Yes.
and actually move the buses around based upon where the people are living and where their jobs are at. So for instance, if their jobs happen to be at some business in Eagan, because that might be where the jobs are that people on the east side are actually going to, well, let's have more buses going between St. Paul and Eagan, rather than saying we're going to build a BRT through the woods in the backyards of people's homes in Maplewood.
After you remove all the existing vegetation,
Yeah.
and that's not my term, that's the term of the staff people that are running the Rush Line, that's got a price tag on it that's probably out of date by now, $400 million. $400 million to take all the trees down on the Bruce Vento Trail and put in a bunch of concrete so that the county commissioners can say, isn't it wonderful, we can take a bus all the way up the Vento Trail that will exist no more, in a sense, to Victoria Reinhardt's front door.
Right now,
Big deal.
And getting to the point where you were talking about this study where they were showing that there's a greater number of cars per capita in the more wealthy areas, correct?
Yes.
The question then that the St. Paul City Council isn't addressing is that then they will have to go to, like, say, for instance, Highland, and try to convince the folks that have the higher incomes and the greater number of cars per capita that somehow that they should give up their cars. And this is not something that I think that they're going to feel comfortable doing, going to Highland and telling those folks, you're going to have to give up your cars because your neighborhood has more cars than what our plan calls for. And so now you have a quota that you need to get rid of 10% of your cars, and you need to quantify that because we're going to have a data-driven initiative here. And so each neighborhood is going to have to look at how many cars they have and how many cars are you going to get rid of. Do you think that the residents of Highland are going to want to have to be told that they need to determine who in their neighborhood is going to have 10 to 20% fewer vehicles?
I think I think that Mr. Russ Stark knows the answer. And I think that those people on the city council that looked at that record, hopefully that he kept of his meetings with those folks, would document that, no, they're not happy with the idea that they're going to leave their car somewhere or not have part of the car that they got now so that they can get on a bus that they've probably worked hard to not get on, or a train or what have you.
Right.
And this is all part of what he was talking about, changing lifestyles. Well, that's all well and good, but you know, what is the city going to do with all those ramps that they own? You know,
See, now that is an unintended consequence
Yeah.
for the St. Paul City Council government, because now they have St. Paul has huge property interests in parking ramps.
They do.
And people may think, well, you know, there's one or two, but there's really a lot more than that, isn't there?
There are. In fact, the city owns a lot of off-street parking. 9,500, this is a study that was done back in, by the city back in 2015, said they had 9,507 spots. Now they may have more, they may have less than that, but that's what they had, and that's a pretty good number. Their total parking capacity downtown was over 28,000 spots, and they had and only 1,600 of those were on the street. Then they had a number of spots too that were reserved for tenants or you know, employees at various locations, but there aren't that many. They had about 86% of those private spots were available for public use. So you've got an impact on private people that own ramps and parking spots that want to pay off their debts to build and operate those things and their operating costs as well as their bonded indebtedness, and the city's in the same position. So, you know, I don't see where they've addressed any of that. And of course, you know, if they want to reduce the citizens of St. Paul with regard to cars, are they going to tell all those people stop at the border of the city? Are they going to try and resurrect parking ramps elsewhere? I don't know. This is kind of the absurdity that you can get into when you have these statist type plans, in my opinion.
And you got my mind thinking when you're talking about you know, cars, and we're thinking about city government property. I know that when I was mayor of Maplewood, for instance, the city of Maplewood had cars that were available for city staff to use to go to various functions or events or whatever. So I'm assuming that the city of St. Paul also has a fleet of vehicles.
For sure.
And so maybe this initiative should start at City Hall first, and that they should reduce 10% of their vehicles and see what the impact is on their effectiveness for operating and having their employees be able to go to events, or you know what I mean.
Well, the city did, I remember under Mayor Chris Coleman, that they had a Ford Transit, I forget how many they got, maybe a couple, that were plug-in vehicles that were used by, and I don't recall which department, to tell you the truth. And then recently, the current mayor got a grant from the MPCA to change out a lot of the equipment at Public Works that was dated, had old diesel engines.
Oh, okay.
And they bought some better operating equipment, new stuff that had much less emissions and that type of thing, which is great. And I'm sure that inside their organization, which I'm not intimately familiar with, they have probably made, like the state of Minnesota has, a transition to other fuels than gasoline with a lot of their vehicles.
Well, that's good to hear, because when you're starting to put initiatives out on the public, you want to make sure that your own house is in order.
Yeah, and they have spent money, not tremendous amounts, but at various locations, public locations, with charging stations. So they're coming along, but you know, this is a small step. You know, they're not really competing with the gasoline vendors, you know, the holiday stores quite yet.
Yes. Well, let's continue with our next clip.
And then the other piece is that we need to move toward electric vehicles for those car trips that we are taking, with needed uptakes of about a third of all vehicles by 2030 becoming electric and 80% by 2040, both of which are theoretically achievable. But if you think about the lifespan of someone's private vehicle, it's 12 to 15 years. There's only potentially, say, 2 vehicle purchases between now and 2050. And so the trickiness of this work is that we have to make it easier for people to not own the car in the first place, and then make it easier for those cars to be electric.
So we heard several things there, and I do want to comment in the get-go is that this idea of switching over to electric vehicles, of course, is very dependent upon the market being able to produce an electric vehicle that meets the needs of the consumer and for it to be affordable. Because there again, if you have a vehicle, like an electric vehicle, that does not get you from St. Paul to your job in Shakopee because it's too far away and the battery doesn't last that long, it's impractical to say you're going to have an electric vehicle. It's also impractical that if you happen to live in one of the wards that has the average low, as an average income, some of the lower household incomes, you're not going to have a household that can afford an electric vehicle. They can afford a regular car, but they can't afford an electric car. And so there's a lot of issues with saying, well, we're going to have, 33% of the vehicles are going to be electric. I mean, that may be theoretically an aspirational goal for any community in the whole entire world, but it's very dependent upon many, many factors that the city of St. Paul simply doesn't have any control over.
It's the truth. There's so many factors. For one thing, Mr. Stark's talking about how long cars last. Well, let's talk about how long the batteries last in his electric cars. And I've kind of looked at this myself, as a potentially interested person who's not rich, taking advantage of the significant depreciation that has occurred on some of the models that came out in the, let's say 2012 neighborhood versus the new models now. Well, the depreciation is correlated directly with the fact that these batteries have an 8-year warranty typically by the manufacturers. And so to the extent that you can acquire a vehicle that has plenty of time left on the battery, and the battery doesn't go outside that warranty period, doesn't exhaust itself outside the warranty period, well, it may be a great bargain if you can find one of those vehicles, and they're out there. But there's a whole lot more out there that have depreciated significantly because they're outside the warranty period, and they're going to need that new battery. And depending on the size of the battery, and that varies tremendously across the spectrum of these electric cars, you can be on the low end with the smallest batteries. You could be talking $6,000.
And $6,000 for a battery?
For a battery.
So it's
for a
not
small
like,
battery.
So it's not like just going to Walmart and saying, okay, I need to go get my car battery, and I'm going to be flipping out $100.
Yeah, and I'll give you an example. The first mass-produced electric car that was sold in this country didn't sell a lot of units, unfortunately. Was a Mitsubishi model. And it was very small, it looked kind of odd. It was called the I for innovation. And it's kind of a clever item. And they sell them now still in other parts of the world, but they no longer market them directly in the United States. But you do have a market for the 2,000 or so that they sold in 1 year, as I recall. I can't remember which year that was. But they never were big sellers. But they have a small battery that got a range of about 62 miles. On a single charge. So
if you had a job in Shakopee and you live in St. Paul, you could at least get to work and back almost, not quite.
Well, and then too, you have to consider where we live. Minnesota, before we had climate change, it was cold. And even now that we've had climate change, it's still cold. Cold enough that even this little car that Mitsubishi offered with its modest range, which is at the low end now, you know, you're going to lose 25% minimum in the winter, most people say, on the range of these batteries. Plus, as the car gets older, that shaves off some range too. So now, you know, there's a BMW model. Maybe all those folks out in Highland will buy that, and then they can sell them to the people on the east side someday. But candidly, there are problems with the range of these things. And I ask your viewers, when is the last time anybody saw an electric car on a television ad? Right? The manufacturers aren't really pushing these things.
Or think about it even in the movies that you watch. They got these high-speed chases. Are any of them electric cars?
Yeah. Well,
oh, forget it. Stop. Hold on. I got to plug my car in before we race down the street any further.
Yeah, and they're, you know, that's another thing too, is the charging stations are not uniform. Tesla has a particular type of charging method, if you will, connection, adapter, whatever you want to call it. And they've built their own little network. Nissan, you know, they've got something, and you know, Mitsubishi on that particular model, they had 3 different ways you could go. So there's, you know, it's an evolving thing.
Yes.
And you know, I mean, the Leaf is a great car. You know, it's very plain, and some people who just are into this thing for the economy would probably love to have one because you don't have to stop at Holiday, except to maybe put some air in the tires. You know, seriously. So there are. I mean, I think this electric thing is great. But let me give you a comment that I read in a report on this thing here, and it actually quotes.
And this is right from the report itself.
Well, this is a news story that was written about the report in June.
Oh, I see.
And this reporter talked to Mr. Stark, so the sustainability officer. And the quote here is, you know, along this line: driving an electric vehicle alone is an inefficient use of energy, Stark said. Replacing gas-powered vehicles with electric models statewide would increase electricity demand by 50% in Minnesota. An enormous burden on top of what we're planning to do to transition to renewables to meet the current demand. Now he's talking.
So this is the same guy who's giving this presentation to
Right.
the St. Paul City Council.
Yeah, this was.
And he's the same guy who just gave that quote that you read, that electric cars are an inefficient use of energy.
Well, to the extent, yeah, I mean, you know, and he's saying that also, you know, if St. Paul did nothing, carbon emissions would decline by 40% because the building sector, and by 2030, will have much cleaner energy, said another person.
And you know,
not the Mr. Stark, but another individual.
And we'll be coming to a graph that shows exactly that. So let's take a look at our next clip.
Just a quick slide showing some of the ways in which we've already been doing that work here in St. Paul, but obviously we need to accelerate on multiple fronts. On the really positive sides, one of the programs we're excited about, and thank you for your support of the Charging Hubs project to date, is this new partnership we've entered into with Xcel Energy, our car in Minneapolis, to deliver 70 charging hubs across the 2 cities over the next couple of years that will both serve residents who own their own electric vehicles, having options for charging those vehicles out on St. Paul streets, and also serve electric car share in neighborhoods that haven't had car share service before, including some of our ACP 50 neighborhoods. And we're really excited about that new opportunity.
So here's a new initiative that they're undertaking, which is consistent with the Climate Resilience Plan. Now, he says in this next clip, really what the goal is. Let's listen in.
And pairing car share with transit is a really great way to make it more possible for people to not have to own a vehicle in the first place, which can save a ton of money as well as emissions.
So it sounds like his assumption is that people don't want to have to own cars, that it is It's just one of those things of life that they just have to do, that they don't really want to have a car. And yet I'm not so certain that that's the way people look at their car. Many of my clients are senior citizens, and the last thing that they want to give up, that they relate to their independence, is their car. They don't want to give up their car because a car is a way of being independent, of being able to come and go. And you notice there was a picture of a little scooter there. Well, those little scooters that you can ride around on the sidewalks are just fine and dandy. But try to go grocery shopping and carrying your groceries home with one of those. I'd like to see if any of the city council members actually can ride one of those. I don't know of any seniors who actually want to risk falling off one of those and breaking a hip riding one of those either. So you see, there's a lot of questions raised by this whole thing and this assumption that people don't want to own cars. Now, in our next slide, we'll be getting to that graph that I was mentioning to you, Mr. Copeland, that shows the contributors to the climate change.
This slide really summarizes the emissions side of the plan. To summarize it, the top red line indicates our emissions over time should we essentially do nothing, the business as usual model of where we are and where we're headed. Emissions would otherwise go up, but for the actions that are being taken because our population is growing, we continue to see growth in demand across the system. The second red line from the top shows that Xcel's commitment over time to 100% clean electricity by 2050 would reduce those business as usual emissions.
So when you're looking at that graph, that very first blue swath is commercial energy, the energy that's being used by the commercial and the business entities of our communities. That's what that is. And it's not until you get down another line or two, you get to that light green, that is travel related. And when we look at this graph again, take a look at that green swath, and if nothing is done at all, it actually doesn't just level off, it actually goes down if we do nothing at all. So let's look at our next clip where you'll have an opportunity of looking at that graph one more time and analyzing exactly what it says to you.
The next red line down, the dashed red line, shows the accumulation of all the actions we've identified in this plan would get us to 70 to 75% reduction by 2050, not down to net zero. The point of which is just to say that we literally haven't figured out how to get all the way down to zero by 2050. We know it's going to be challenging, and some of those particularly challenging pieces will be the ways in which we fuel larger vehicles, the ways in which we travel in an intercity way, in planes, for example, and the use of natural gas as a power source for those really big energy users, such as manufacturing and industry. Those will be some of the toughest pieces of all.
So that graph is actually very fascinating to look at because it gives you an idea exactly what contributes the most to the issue. Now, as we go to the next clip, it shows how you can, as an individual, have the greatest impact in what you are doing in your day-to-day life. So let's take a look at that.
Then, in terms of emissions reduction, this chart is a nice summary of the things that people can do as individuals to reduce their carbon footprints. We will not individual action our way out of this problem. Most of the solutions are going to come at the systemic level. At the same time, there are things that all of us can be doing in our daily lives to contribute to the solutions, and it's important for folks to know that and to try to create this climate of climate action and resilience.
It shows what is of a low impact and what's of a low impact.
This whole discussion that Mr. Stark was having regarding people that don't want cars. Well, you know, on a youthful level, people that are, you know, in college or making their way out of college and that type of thing, there does seem to be a cultural change that some of them haven't got their driver's licenses. They don't seem to have the interest that we had back in my time at that point in life in automobiles. Fine. But as you point out, there's, you know, it's not just the grocery store, but I imagine when the people start getting married and having the children and, you know, there's other things that have to happen. You got to get to the doctor. You got to take the kids to child care. On all these things, you know, if you got child care in the neighborhood and you can walk to it, God bless you. And they're talking about the Highland Village as a area where we can have this great social experiment and create all this walkable community. But I think they did put roads in there. No, I noticed that they've got some plans already in the hopper to change things. But I doubt that Ryan Companies is eliminating the roads. Now, I don't know. So we'll see. But
Well, now, talking about the Ryan Company,
Yeah.
You were mentioning before the show that, of course, with the Ford development area there, that, you know, Ryan, the plans were basically approved, but now they've submitted all types of amendments, correct?
yeah, I just got a notice the other day, a couple days ago, I guess it was, from the city that their company submitted a plan on the 31st of last month, January. They only bought the property, as I recall, in December, and they've got several, because it was plural, amendments that they want to make to the grand plan there. And it's in some executive summary, according to the document that was submitted with the application, which was not accessible by my little computer to look up and check all out. But they've got several areas where they've got the big red X, and I'm not that familiar with the project to comment, but you know, within less than a month of ownership, they're already amending the grand plan. And I'm thinking of Hillcrest, where, you know, the city never asked anybody what they wanted over there, and now they're going to have a meeting next week, by the way, on the 12th of February, to have the citizen input on the plan that's already been created by, well, is it the city planning department? Is it the city port authority? Is it somebody else?
Well, the answer is the technical advisory
There
committee.
you go.
That's who put together the plan.
And at 5:45, they're going to be making a presentation to the public of what it is that they want to show the public.
Well, getting back to our discussion this evening about transportation and the impact of transportation on climate change and St. Paul City Council's climate resilience plan. You know, you were mentioning how, you know, certainly that depending upon where you are in your various stages of life may have a great bearing on your need for a vehicle. And I was just thinking back myself, when I was an undergraduate in college, the first couple of years, you know, I didn't have a car either. I used the bus. I got on the bus, went to my job, got on the bus, went back to school, and it worked out just fine. But then as time went on, and I found that there were more things that I wanted to be involved with, and there was more involved than just going from school to work and work to school, because at the time I lived at the dorm on the campus. By bus was fine. But once you become more independent and you're living off campus, and then you're working, and then you find that there's other activities in town you want to go to, suddenly then you find that there's a need for a car. And then you talked about, well, people get married, they start having kids. Well, my goodness, how are you going to be carrying 3-4 kids on the bus, dropping them all off at daycare? So you see, I've been there, done that.
We haven't perfected the simple range on electric cars. We don't have the capacity within the current system to accommodate the wholesale change that is proposed by these folks that are going to save us from whatever it is. So I'll leave it there. But and it's not that I think, there's some good reasons to make a change. electric cars are a lot easier to maintain. There's going to be some guys that are playing around with wrenches that are perhaps going to be doing something else.
Well, now let's move ahead to clip number 14, where one of the city council members talks about how this will be used. This plan and adopting it is going to be used in looking at decisions about development.
And I really see this as a chance to hold up zoning and land use and transportation decisions to a new standard that we're hopefully setting tonight with our climate plan, and using that as an accountability metric or a basis for hitting goals going forward. So it's helpful to hear where that work is headed and how it interacts with other things that we have.
So then this brings us again to that question. We've got the Hillcrest development that the St. Paul City and the Port Authority are heavily engaged in, considering the fact that, you know, they got $10 million invested in that site alone. They've got the Ford plant area that's being developed by the Ryan companies. Well, I'm wondering now that they've adopted this climate resilience plan, if they're going to use it as the yardstick by which to measure all of those amendments that Ryan has submitted to the plan. You see, there's a lot of complications that this now will produce, and we'll just have to see whether or not that the words that they say at their December meeting, how well they can stick to them as they work through these development issues.
Well, and when you're dealing with a city that has the level of poverty that we have across much of the city, you know, perhaps you're looking at the north end, you look at the whole east side, you're looking at the west side in particular, those areas, that's a lot of our city of St. Paul. And to think that somehow we're going to create all this new high density for all these low income people, and they're all going to have fewer cars and everything is going to be just wonderful. You know, if you've been downtown, it's kind of quiet. Look at all the office space that is not rented. There's no job for nobody. I don't care who the hell you are, whether you're out of school with a master's degree, a doctorate, whatever it may be, or you're just a young man or woman that wants to start out in some business activity that may have been at one time located downtown. It's quiet down there. Mm-hmm. It's real quiet. And, you know, the official number is about 21% plus, you know, vacancy rate.
Wow.
For last year that I saw in one of the business magazines here not long ago. So that, you know, that's a high rate. And the only reason it isn't higher is because we've had all these apartment conversions of former office space, which is fine because at least there's a place for people to live that want to live downtown. And that may be the future for downtown. But if we want to get some real tax dollars coming into our community from people that own businesses that produce things, that generate capital and investment and the rest, we better think a little bit more about maybe, hey, tying that downtown in with that airport we've got down there. And I'm not talking about MSP. I'm talking about that place that nobody talks about in St. Paul. I don't know why. We pretend that we don't have an airport where you can take an executive.
But remember this climate resilience plan
I know.
wants to decrease the amount of air traffic. So does that mean that the St. Paul City Council is going to put restrictions on the St. Paul Airport? Good question. But you see, we have one council member who did bring up the question about the poor in St. Paul and the impact on them. So let's go to clip number 17.
Mr. Tao.
Thank you, Council President. Mr. Starks, thank you for your work on this. What are your thoughts or plan about engaging members of the community who may, you know, tonight they're thinking about when are they going to get their next meal, but this issue is equally important to them, and so put much thought to engaging with them.
Mm-hmm. Council President, Councilmember Tal, thanks for the question. Yes, it can be difficult to engage with folks who are concerned literally about the next meal on a topic that is more kind of global and where the impacts and solutions are felt more over time.
At least he acknowledges that it is sometimes hard to incorporate the concerns of the folks from the east side into such a plan as this, is because they have bigger issues on their mind. But then he goes on to talk about what were some of their comments at one of their community outreach sessions. Let's continue.
We had a really great dialogue at the Frogtown Forum that we had on this topic, which engaged with a lot of folks who are in those kinds of circumstances. And it was interesting the kinds of issues that they focused on, which were, yes, how do I reduce my energy bill in my home, to our earlier conversation with Councilmember Prince, and also the issue of trees and the value of trees, in the sense that some neighborhoods have fewer than others, and the notion that my neighborhood might actually be hotter than your neighborhood as a result of that issue seems like a really key one for some of the folks in that room.
And certainly trees are one of the best ways to have a good environment, and I think trees actually contribute to counteracting some of these issues that are created by the fact that we as humans live here on this earth. And that brings us back to the Bruce Vento Trail, where they don't see a value to the trees, and they're just going to rip down thousands of trees along the Bruce Vento Trail in order to put in a big concrete and bituminous freeway through the woods and people's backyards, so that they can put in a BRT, and saying that they're going to be efficient and ecological in that they're going to move everybody from cars to a bus. So you see, there's a little bit of conflict in all of that, isn't it? And yet it's the folks there at the Frogtown Forum that they are saying, well, we believe we need to have more trees in our neighborhood because that's part of the solution to us. And of course, they want to decrease their energy bills. Well, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Because on that graph that we looked at, we saw that the contribution of residential electric was one of the top contributors to this whole discussion. Now, the council had a resolution before them to pass this climate resilience plan. And they had three actually amendments before them to modify it. The first amendment we're not going to cover, but the second and third one we are, because they go to that piece of equity. We hear so often that many of the decisions that are being made by the policymakers nowadays are grounded in equity, or as Ramsey County Victoria Reinhardt said, Ramsey County uses the lens of equity and looking at their decisions. Well, okay, it's the same in St. Paul and St. Paul City Council. They want to look at this with the eyes of equity. Let's take a look at our next clip that covers amendment number 2 to the resolution.
So amendment number 2 is adding specificity on equity and inclusion and metrics. And I think throughout the plan, you'll see references to equity, inclusion, and metrics. But this is adding some very particular language in page 62, adding language. It currently says work with state and regional partners to develop a robust workforce development program that includes recruitment and training of building energy workers and provides opportunity, and we're adding especially for low-income populations, communities of color, and youth, while reaching the city's GHG targets. I'm adding a CO12 that says work with state, regional partners, and city departments such as Office for Financial Empowerment and Planning and Economic Development to strengthen capacity of firms owned by people of color and nonprofits serving underrepresented and underserved communities to facilitate equity, co-benefits of economic development and building sector, and CO13, which says develop qualitative and quantitative climate action metrics to measure progress, which explicitly incorporate evaluation of benefits and burdens to low-income populations and people of color. And I move this amendment to is there discussion?
So they've got two different pieces of equity built into this amendment. One is that in order to implement the policies of this new plan, they want to make sure that they're hiring people of color and who have disproportionate impacts to them, that they are part of implementing it so that they get a job. Okay, so that's one level of equity. And then the other part is that they're going to put together some kind of metrics to figure out what is the impact of those who are poor or those who are people of color. What's the impact of all this? Now, here's the question, is that maybe part of that should have already been done before they adopted the plan. Because if you would have had that done before you adopted the plan, you could have actually crafted the plan more specifically to address that issue rather than kicking the can down the road. Now let's take a look at our last clip, which addresses the amendment number 3, which also has a focus on, imagine, equity.
Finally, Amendment 3, page 39 of the plan, it is in addition to the section about installation of rooftop solar, which adds a section that says, community solar gardens are another important resource for making renewable energy accessible and affordable for renters and lower income homeowners. Sitting CSGs within the community where power is being used increases grid resilience and can create benefits for low-income community and communities of color. Developing renewable, equitable, and locally produced distributed energy from rooftop solar and community solar gardens will establish St. Paul as a clean energy leader. It will reduce our dependence on electricity from fossil fuel power plants that have not yet been retired. In addition to increasing resilience and equity, producing distributed renewable energy will enable a more rapid transition to beneficial electrification of transportation and heating. Any discussion on this Amendment 3? All right, I will move Amendment 3. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Now, that particular amendment focused on renewable energy and how to have more of that available throughout all of St. Paul. And yet it kind of sounded like they just threw in the word equity and equitable just so that way it was included in there. I didn't really see how it matched up with actually understanding how it impacts communities of color or lower income communities.
So there's an equity discussion really yet to be had because everything costs money. This idea of equity is wonderful, but it costs money. You know, they never talk about that. There's no budget for equity in the budget, I notice. It's not a line item anywhere that I've
Well,
seen.
and it's such a multifaceted
Well, sure.
discussion. It isn't just we've got a Band-Aid that we can stick on something and say, okay, now we've addressed equity. I mean, it doesn't really quite work that way. But we don't have time on the rest of our show to discuss that because we've come to the end of our show. So I want to thank you, Mr. Copeland, for being here.
Love being with you, Diana.
And viewers, thank you for tuning in to this episode of Off the Record News. We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.